Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar where we'll be talking about the ISE's annual survey. My name is Steve Ishwood. I'm Chief Executive of the ISE. I'll shortly be introducing Nicola, who's our Head of Research. But just before we get started into this, let me just give you an idea of the format. As with all our webinars, we want it to be as interactive as possible. So Nicola's going to spend roughly sort of 30-40 minutes talking through the results of the survey and her analysis. And then we've also got plenty of time for Q&A afterwards. So if you've got any questions, pop them into the chat. And we've got quite a lot of people on the webinar, so it's probably easier if we do it that way rather than show of hands. So yeah, either use the Q&A, pop them into chat. I'll be keeping an eye there, so Nicola doesn't have to try and do two things at once. We're also recording the session, so actually, if you want to go back and pick up on any details, you'll be able to do that, or share the link, obviously, with colleagues. The survey is also, I think, online now. Actually, we put it online because today it's been officially released, and you probably picked up, or you might have picked up bits and pieces that are running in the press as usual, even though there's an awful lot going on. It's a little bit difficult to get a cut through with something like this, but even despite all the stuff that we're reading about, it's been picked up by quite a few news outlets. Anyway, the stuff you really want to hear is what Nicola's going to tell you. It's actually what the survey says, not what me babbling on about it. So Nicola, can I hand it over to you, and you tell us what we found this year?
Absolutely. Cool. So I'm just gonna share my screen and do the obligatory. Can you see? Just one second. Can you see that?
Yep, that's come through. Nice.
Okay, perfect. Cool. So thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. I know it's the typical afternoon lull at the moment, so I'll do my best to keep high pace and high energy. So obviously you've tuned in to hear what on earth are the results of the student recruitment survey this year. So the surveys are an absolute institution. We run a range of surveys, polls, and research projects. Many of them have been run for decades in one form or another, which gives us an awesome database and data set to analyze our results against and benchmark against. The recruitment survey is our flagship research report each year. So really excited to tell you what's been going on. And it tells us what's happening in the student labor market and also how employers are currently responding. So this year, the survey ran in August and September. There were 77 questions that are super extensive. So a huge thank you to employers who completed it. 168 employers responded, and it covered a total of 32,110 student hires. So I'm going to talk a little bit around the demographics and who answered and the demographics that we're reporting on. And then I'm going to tell you about the structure of how I'll present the findings today. But drop in any questions that you have or any thoughts, and it will be great to pick up on those later. So as I mentioned, there were around 32,000 students, and the breakdown in terms of how they were hired was 61% of these that were reported on were graduates, 24% school and college leavers, and 15% interns and placement students. So this is a pretty typical breakdown. There are obviously a range of sectors that were represented in this survey. So we can see that these range from finance and professional services, that was hovering around 36% as the biggest chunk in sector representation, legal 26%, digital and IT at 29%, also at 26% energy, engineering and industry, and then that ranges right down to health and pharmaceuticals at 6%. So there's quite a very breakdown across the different sectors, and that enables us to get quite specific in some of the sector analysis. But obviously when we get right into the fine data and nuanced data, sometimes with the smaller sectors, if we're looking at specific things, there's a little bit of practice needed in terms of interpreting the results if the sample size gets too small. But we've obviously reported those things in the report. So I want to jump in and make the most of the time, and then of course hear what you think. Is this in line with your expectations and what you're seeing in the student labor market? I want to cover off the 5 biggest student recruitment trends that became evident through our report. So the first is that there's wider market pressures, and these are shaping the student labor market. The second is that school and college leaver recruitment is a continued focus. The third is that selection practices are changing. Fourth, inflation and recession is impacting salaries across the board. This won't be a surprise to you, but I want to show you exactly how and how this differs between sectors. And finally, diversity matters, but of course there's more to do. But I want to pull diversity in and talk about it more and how it relates to what's going on in the student recruitment market. So let's focus first on the wider market pressures that you'll hear continuously about, obviously, in the press at the moment, what's happening in the economy, potential recession implications, and how this is shaping the student labour market. So I'm going to cover off just briefly some points around the student labour market before drilling down specifically into some of the results that we got this year. So at the moment, for context, I'm sure you're already aware, there's decades-long low unemployment. So this is hovering around 3.6%, which is some of the lowest unemployment in decades. There's sustained staff shortages, that's a tongue twister, across different sectors. And this has wider implications for the labour market, not just the student labour market, but specifically looking at our respondents. This year, we could see that these trends really impacted renege rates. It lowered application rates and it was impacting salaries. So wages are rising slowly, with graduate salaries rising at 1.37% from last year. School and college leaver salaries rising ever so slightly at 0.16%, and placement and intern salaries rising at 4.88%. And this was compared to last year. So very, very slowly rising salaries. This is due to current inflation rates due to the current inflation rates in the UK. Students are actually experiencing a real wage decrease, as probably most of us are. And this is interesting when we start to consider the rates of application and unfilled vacancies, which I'll come on to a little bit later. And finally, just for some context setting at the beginning, this year's employers reported increased number of unfilled vacancies. So just for context, last year, or in 2020 rather, this was only 3% of unfilled vacancies. This year, 9%, so quite a steep jump in only 2 years. And the highest percentage of reneges from graduates and school leavers really since we started collecting data on reneges in 2017. And this is at 12% up from only 7% last year. So when we look at projections of hiring into next year, which is the final column, we can actually see that projections are showing that there's stagnating levels of vacancies. On the one hand, this is good news because there isn't a reduction in vacancies as there has been in other periods of economic recession. With the OECD and major financial institutions projecting that the UK will be entering recession probably at the end of this year and into next year. That's a positive news story on the one hand, that there isn't a contraction in number of vacancies projected. Nevertheless, of course, there isn't the continued growth, or rather the explosive growth that we've seen in a post-COVID economy. Interestingly, which is something I want to pick up and talk about later, is that the school and college leaver vacancies, which is the pink bar on the far right, is sustained growth. And this shows really the importance of continuing investing in apprenticeships, how the market's responding to the apprenticeship levy, and also the renewed sort of strategic focus and continued strategic focus on school and college leavers. A point that I think is very interesting is when we look at the quality of graduate hires specifically. So we ask employers from a scale of never to almost always, how often can you recruit the quality of graduate hires that you need? This year, we can see at the all sectors bar, which is on the bottom, 36% of all sectors said that they can almost always recruit. And that's lower, considerably lower than last year, which was hovering at 65% across all sectors. So we can see quite a considerable reduction in employers that note they can almost always recruit the quality of graduate hires that they need. There's a number of factors which could be influencing this, but it's interesting to understand how these level of unfilled vacancies, the contraction and reduction in real spending power for graduates, and the reduced level of applications may be impacting the quality of graduates that can be hired at the moment. We also saw that there's difficulty in recruiting, and this has increased from last year. So some of the roles that were more difficult to recruit than others, I've pulled out specifically below. So 43% of respondents that recruit graduates reported finding at least one role difficult to fill. This was an increase from last year. And the 5 most difficult to fill roles were engineering, IT programming and development, IT in general, technical and analytical roles, accountancy, and audit roles. I want to come on to look at the percentage of vacancies filled and see how this has tracked really since 2019. And we can see that actually the percentage of vacancies filled for graduates and school and college leavers has fallen over the last few years, considerably now to hovering around the 90% and 92%. So it's interesting to see how the pressures and the contraction of the economy is forcing some roles to go unfilled. And when we look specifically at the proportion of school and college leavers that were filled, and this is broken down by sector, we can see that this doesn't influence all sectors the same, obviously, just honing into school and college leavers here, we can see that actually at this level, charity and public sectors roles were filled 100% of the time, whereas in fact for our sample in the retail and FMCG sector, they could only fill their 82% of their school and college leaver roles. And most of these roles will be allocating people onto apprenticeships. So it's interesting to see how different school and college leavers are attracted to different sectors and what sort of roles are going unfilled. When we consider pipelining and sort of strategic management of talent, it makes sense that these school and college leavers who are entering at the apprenticeship level will go on to be experienced hires eventually. And when we consider this shortage nationwide for retail and FMCG roles, it is an alarming picture in terms of the lower rate of roles that are filled in this category. Coming on to the average annual percent of reneges, it's also important to understand are people accepting roles and to what rate. And we can see here that there's also the upward trend. And this is tracing back from when we started collecting the data in 2017. So I think this all is painting an important sort of picture of the economy at large and how these factors are starting to influence the school and college market. Just before I move on, I want to make what I would consider to be quite an important point. So obviously we know through periods of economic downturn and recession, hiring freezes are often implemented. But I think one point I wanted to make in this report is when we zoom out and we sort of see graduate and school and college leaver and intern and placement hiring as a strategic pipeline of talent, it's important to, I think, consider where we'll be in 3 years. And if we cut all of these schemes and cohorts by a big percentage, I think there'll be even more pressure in hiring experienced hires in 3 or 4 years where we would usually be pipelining from these schemes. So I think it's important to, of course, pay attention to economic data that's happening in the UK and the general climate, but not be too knee-jerk in terms of hiring freezes. So I want to move now onto school and college leaver recruitment and show how this is a continued focus. So we can see here that there's actually been 18% growth in the school and college leaver hiring since 2021. And this shows, even through the pandemic, which is quite a feat, the sustained level of growth in this market since 2015. We can see across all sectors compared to last year, actually, where is there the most growth, where is there the least growth, and this looks at the average number of school and college leavers recruited across organizations. And the pink bar at the bottom of each section shows the change from 2021 to 2022. So across all sectors, there was 18–19% growth, but across specific sectors, there was more. Right from the top at legal with the most growth, 73%, and then the least growth was in retail and FMCG. When we look at average applications received for school and college leavers by sector, we can see that there's quite some change in some sectors. And as I mentioned before, this correlates quite well with the reports from employers in terms of which sectors were struggling to fill their roles the most. So we can see that there's been a downwards trend for retail, FMCG, energy, engineering and industry in terms of the average applications received for these roles. Specifically to call out, retail and FMCG had a reduction of 81% of average applications, which is considerable. Yet when we zoom out to all sectors, there was actually 3.5% growth in applications per vacancy compared to last year. So there's been some major contractions in terms of average applications received and some levels of growth. So what roles are most in demand? We can see here at the school and college levers that general business and administration is the most in demand in terms of what people are being recruited for. That's 26% of the vacancies. Moving down, we've got engineering, programming and development, accountancy and audit, IT general, technical and analytical roles, legal, and so on and so forth, right down to science and research at only 2%. So coming now onto selection practices, I think it's important to call out that selection practices are changing considerably. So we can see that there's changes in minimum requirements. And this is something important to note because the proportion of employers using these educational qualifications as minimum requirement has been on a downwards trend. And this is from when we started collecting this data in 2013. So we can see the top line there in orange is looking at employers who use 2-1 as an educational requirement, minimum requirement. The yellow line is employers that use A-levels. So, and the black line, which is the line at the bottom, is employers that have no minimum educational requirement. And we can see there that, of course, orange and yellow are trend lining down, whereas the no minimum requirement is trending upwards. And what this really says to us is that on the one hand, employers are widening and broadening the pool of applicants that they're trying to attract. On the other, as employers develop more and more sophisticated selection techniques, there's more trust in the selection process and less emphasis placed on using educational qualifications to sift out candidates at first point of entry. So I think it's important to understand the sort of knock-on positive consequences from removing educational qualifications as minimum requirements. We know through research that, of course, removing educational qualifications as the point of minimum requirement at entry has really positive implications for diversity and inclusion, which is something that we'll come on to later. So it would be great if we, at the end when we wrap up, if this has been your experience as an employer, what do you think about this? And have you noticed any changes in your own graduate recruitment? When we look specifically at the use of personality tests as a part of the selection process, we can see that there's been a downwards trend from 2014 when we first started collecting this data to now. So in 2014, 32% of employers use personality tests in their recruitment process, and this has been steadily decreasing over time. Now we're hovering at only 9%. So it's been an interesting trend as well, as I mentioned, to consider how education requirements, the shift away from that, the shift away from using personality tests in recruitment are shaping the selection process and the selection landscape in terms of graduate schemes specifically. Looking at the most and least effective selection activities, just checking that you can still see my slides.
They disappeared for some reason, Nicola.
That's all right. Let me just get them back. Can you see them?
There you go. Yeah,
okay,
they're back now.
Okay, cool. So looking specifically at the most and least effective selection activities that were reported this year. So on the one hand, we asked employers what are the most effective at first stage and then at final stage in terms of the selection process. We can see here that actually psychometric and aptitude assessments were ranked as most effective in first stage. Considering the reduction of employers who are using personality tests and the level of employers that said they were using numerical and verbal reasoning and aptitude assessments, it's safe to say that that's where the majority of employers sit in terms of this. And 43% rank that this is the most effective assessment at first stage. Next is application forms. Then we're moving down to CVs and interviews as the top 4 first stage application selection activities. Moving further down, of course, we've got assessment center and gamified assessments, which are increasing in use, but aren't seen as the most effective at the first stage. Then we're hovering right down to other selection activities, case studies, email inbox exercises, group tasks, role play, and virtual reality exercises, which are not deemed effective at first stage. Moving on to final stage, we can see that there is some consistency with interviews being selected as the second most effective final stage activity, but assessment centers are seen as the first. Then there's group tasks at 16%, skill tests, which are hovering at 13%, some psychometric and aptitude assessments here. And then again, moving down through a range of different selection activities, right again down to virtual reality. So safe to say that the VR boom in terms of using VR as a selection activity hasn't taken off, at least not in our employers in the graduate labour market. But it's interesting to see and compare how this ranks to the years prior. And there's quite a lot of consistency in terms of application forms, CVs and interviews at first stage, and assessment centre and interviews at second stage. One thing that we introduced this year in terms of asking employers was asking, are they using AI and algorithms within their selection process? So some sectors were using AI in their recruitment process more than others, with finance and professional services using AI and algorithms the most, digital and IT the second, and third equal across health and pharmaceuticals, legal, energy, engineering, and industry. When we asked what activities were being automated, we could see that the majority of employers were using algorithms to automate pre-screening candidates. Then the second was to analyze video interviews, and the third was to screen CVs. So if we look back at the most effective, and we can see that CVs and interviews are seen as some of the most first stage effective, and then we compare this to how people are using algorithms in the recruitment process, it makes sense that over time, while of course some of the employers were reporting hesitancy with automating some parts of their process, if some are already using automated processes to analyze interviews and screen CVs, it makes sense that probably over time there'll be an upward trend in terms of organizations using some of these algorithms to automate some of the activities that are deemed the most effective at first stage. Just for context here, only 9% of our employers that answered this survey said that they were using any form of AI or automation in their recruitment process. So we're still absolutely by no means talking about the majority of employers who responded to this questionnaire, but we thought it would be a great benchmark moving forwards over the next 10, 15 years if we can see if people are using AI and automation more in their recruitment process, and then eventually track this to different diversity and inclusion measures. Some proponents of automated recruitment are saying that it can expand the range of diversity and inclusion, and others are saying it can have negative consequences for hiring diverse candidates. I want to move on now to looking at how inflation and recession is impacting salaries this year specifically. So this is a pretty busy graph, and it may not be as big on your screen, but please look at it if you'd like to in the report. But I just want to draw attention to the purple line, which is the level of annual inflation. And we can see, as we all know experientially, that of course annual inflation is tracking up. Yet when we look at the green, the pink and the blue line, which are graduates, interns, placements and school and college leaver salaries, they're tracking downwards. So what this says is that compared to inflation, there's a real-time loss of purchasing powers for graduate, intern, placement students and school and college leavers in terms of their salary. Now, even though there's been a slight increase across the board, it still means that in real terms, there is a loss. In real terms, there's a salary reduction. So it's important to understand how this is going to track through are people looking to move to apply to higher salary roles in graduate schemes that offer a higher salary at this point, and will that shift some of the sectors that are receiving more applicants over time, and will that lead to a reduction in applicants in some of the lower paying sectors? We saw that as an indicator, a tentative indicator this year in terms of some of the sectors that typically pay lower, for example, retail, receiving the lowest level of vacancies, especially in lower salary roles like school and college leavers. So it's important to understand that, yes, of course, across the board, we're all experiencing increased inflation. Yet how this will impact people entering on lower level salaries is to be confirmed. And I'm sure that we'll start to see that panning out this year. When we look more specifically at average salaries in the student labor market, we can see this year that graduates across all sectors, the median salary was $30,921. This is a rise of only 1.4% from last year, so much lower than the salary rises in the previous years. School and college leaver vacancies, the median was 19,725, which was also a slight increase on last year. In terms of placements, the median salary is hovering around 20,000. So we can see that there's some significant minimum and maximum dispersions across all of these different roles. So with graduates, for example, the maximum salary that an employer reported was $57,500, the minimum 19,500. So there's a huge dispersion in terms of the salaries. But as we look at it compared to inflation, it means that effectively this year, graduates have taken a 7.3% pay cut from last year. I think it's important to understand that obviously salary isn't the only financial incentive that employers are offering. And when we look more specifically across the board, we can see that there's a range of financial incentives. And this is a question that I've been asked a lot recently in terms of offering student loans, salary advancement schemes, relocation bonuses, as employers are seeking to broaden the range of financial incentives that they're offering. The most common financial incentive aside from salary that people were offering this year is sign-on bonuses offered by 34% of employers. However, this has only been new offering by 4%. Interest-free loans are the second most common financial incentive offered to graduates this year. Again, only new for 2% of employers. So most of these offerings have been offered to graduates in previous years too. Moving down, we can see transportation allowance, relocation, bonus, and salary advancement schemes. They're all in the top sort of 5 range of things that are offered to graduates. Moving right down, we've got clothing allowance, which is offered by 4%, so not a huge percent of employers, but some are. So most of these things have been offered in previous years, but around 4 to 5% of employers are offering new alternative financial incentives this year to try and attract graduates specifically. I'm conscious of time and obviously want to end with enough time so that we can answer any questions and have a discussion, validate the results. Is this what you've been seeing in the student labour market, and make any clarifications? But I want to end by talking about diversity. So this year, we pulled all the diversity statistics into one section so we can easily benchmark them and understand how they change year on year. Employers targeted diversity programs, and we've reported on this each year, so we can look at increases from last year. So we can see that looking at specific programs, there's been some fluctuation from last year. So looking at increasing the ethnicity, the diversity of ethnicity of students, that's a targeted program, and that's increased by 12% from last year. When we look at other programs, for example, I think it's interesting to understand the targeting of lower socioeconomic background students. In this sample compared to last year, there was actually a reduction of these targeted schemes by 10%. Whether that's sample fluctuation or an actual reduction that people are no longer targeting these groups, it's interesting to consider. If you have any insight or experience in that, it would be great to look at that. When we look at gender balance, we can see that there was a 3% increase in terms of employers targeting this group, increasing the gender split in their cohorts this year, as well as looking at disabled students and targeting a diversity program to increase representation of disabled students and neurodiverse students. Both experienced a 7% and 9% increase respectively in terms of the employers that are targeting these programs. We asked employers what approach did they think was the most effective in recruitment and selection to maximize diversity. Interestingly, 74% of employers thought that training staff in unconscious bias training was the most effective, which I found interesting because there's sort of been a bit of backlash against unconscious bias training in the last couple of years, but obviously that's still seen as something that is highly impactful. Something which is very much backed up by research is analyzing the outcomes of previous campaigns to understand how they are in terms of diversity. And encouragingly, 66% of employers thought that this was incredibly effective in maximizing diversity. This is also similarly related to diversity monitoring, encouraging more diverse assessor groups, and name blind recruitment. As obviously a researcher and a scientist, I know that name blind recruitment is one of the most impactful things that employers can do in terms of increasing their diversity. And I would always encourage employers to do it. It's very cost effective. It's not resource intensive, and it's very much backed up by science. So pleased to see that 36% of employers agree, but ideally that would be raising up there too. When we look at approaches taken, so the other was the perception of what's important, and this is actually the approaches that have been taken by organizations to improve diversity in their selection process. We can see that trained staff involved in unconscious bias training was again rated as a number one thing that approaches that organizations are doing to increase their selection, diversity in their selection. Again, this relates to the other activities. Looking specifically at one thing before we conclude, in the report this year compared to last year, we actually asked what were the demographic breakdowns for your school and college leaver cohort, intern and placement cohort, and graduate cohort. So we can give, unfortunately, there wasn't enough granularity across different sectors as we were getting into too small sample sizes with only 3 or 4 in some sectors. So we decided to present all sector statistics, but this gives a really good indication of what a general benchmark is across each level. So for example, we can see that in school and college leaver cohorts across all sectors, 42% of school and college leavers recruited in these cohorts were female. So this should hopefully provide employers with a benchmark, enabling them to understand how their own cohorts reflect against all sectors. If you're particularly interested in any sector breakdown, for sure, drop us an email. We have a sector breakdown and we'll be able to let you know what the statistics are for different sectors. But if the sample size is too small for different sectors, we will let you know that too. So I want to give time to have a nice conversation and talk about any question and answers that may have. So I'll end here, but go and check out the student recruitment survey. It's available now online. And if you have any questions or comments or concerns or anything else that we can help with, then please feel free to drop us an email.
Great, thanks, Nicola. You covered 70 odd pages of reports very concisely there. So, so I agree with your final sentiment. I encourage people to go and have a look at it online to get more of the detail. We've had some questions come through already. So just a reminder, if you've got any questions for Nicola, pop them either into the Q&A or into the chat. I've got an eye on them here, so I can put them to Nicola. So if I go to those two first, I've also got a couple myself to ask. First question is about reneges. Any ideas on why students are reneging on job offers in the way they are?
Anecdotally, I think a big thing is salary. So people will likely be accepting multiple offers and then simply reneging on the offers that have the lower salaries. And I think that's why we can see a general trend across sectors which are typically paying less. And it makes sense when we consider, as I mentioned, the wider cost of living issues, but it also brings colour to onboarding processes and the importance of sort of keeping candidates warm.
Yes, we had our apprentice forum this morning, which was had some great sessions on it. And actually, one of those sessions, Simon from Connector was saying that for good candidates, that lag between offer made and when they start, if you haven't got your keep warm processes, your candidates that will be at risk. It was interesting, actually. Again, it's anecdotal, but I've heard particularly employers who might have opportunities in maybe, I don't know, what might be perceived as less attractive areas, or where somebody's more likely to be moving away from either where they're from or where they're studied. Some of those candidates tend to be more susceptible. They keep going, don't they? They might not be their first choice of location, but they'll keep going if they see if they get a location they prefer. So yeah, I think there's a lot of issues that we hear from employers in that. It's also interesting, actually, how it goes. It's compare year on year, doesn't it, Nicola? The public sector always seems to do a bit worse as we come out of a more recessionary period or a tighter labour market.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that you mentioned last year and the year before was really this sort of perception of flight to safety, with graduates moving into more secure, I guess, roles which are perceived secure, which is looking a lot at civil service roles and other public sector roles. We can see that makes sense in a period of pandemic where some people are making huge redundancies. Interestingly, though, when we look at periods of recession, because that's often accompanied with high inflation, candidates are shifting to prioritize roles which pay more. So it's shifting away from the perception of security and job security being the most important to sort of more personal financial security being the most important, which means people are prioritizing higher salaries.
Just sticking on the salary point, were you surprised by actually how low the overall increase is in salaries? Because I was, to be honest with you.
I was surprised because a couple months ago, I'm sure some of you saw, we had asked over 100 employees over 100 employers if they were doing an annual pay review for graduates and if they were increasing the salary and by what percentage. The very vast majority said yes, they were, and the percentages ranged from crazy amounts like 50% increased right down to 3%. So I was surprised that wasn't followed through in the last sort of 4 or 5 months since we asked that. However, I think I contacted some that had said yes then and no now, just to get a feel for what had happened in between those 5 months. And I think the reality of a contracting economy and the reality of impending recession has hit employers harder than 5 months ago, when the reality of an incredibly tight labor market was sort of the most important thing. So I think people have been a bit spooked. And 53% of employers in our survey said that they anticipate the recession's coming and it will lead to reduction in hiring in the next year. That's the highest amount that has been on record, even since Brexit, even since COVID. So there's a lot of uncertainty in this current economic crisis, more than has been in an uncertain 3-4 years, which says a lot.
Yeah, and I wondered if the people that answered the earlier Pulse survey actually maybe in areas that, because it was more on their mind, made them more likely to ask. I also know that talking to some employers that the entry level salaries, if you increase those, you automatically then have to increase the previous year's salary by at least that amount. It causes knock-on effects because you've got to keep a sense of growth between year groups. And I know that sometimes causes early talent entry salaries to be repressed. And also organizations prioritize existing workforce, don't they? If the resources are limited, how much sort of budget there is. So it's interesting. Actually, I heard some I was on a call last week. I was seeing some organizations and take some interesting strategies around pay, i.e. not having percentage increases, actually, because aware of the unfairness of a percentage. Those on higher incomes will always get more as a percentage, and fixed level increases, you know, an actual the same amount for every person regardless of seniority. So I think there's going to be some interesting stuff to come on pay, isn't there? Particularly considering today's inflation figures, which are a little bit scary.
Yeah, exactly. I think how so the strategy around pay and pay increases is really starting to come into attention now, and it's starting to be seen, even though it has always been, more and more as a strategic move in terms of keeping and retaining staff, but also attracting. I've heard of candidates now who have been between 2 or 3 employers who have been offered roles, and they've been going back and forth and just increasing their salary by offering counter offers. So I think because the labor market's so tight for specific roles, people are amping up their salaries in terms of new entrants and into different organizations. So it will be interesting to see how it pans out in the next year.
We will, won't it? Right. I've got a couple of questions on here around apprentice and school leaver vacancies. So a question from Chris. What was the total average applications per role for apprentices?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, Chris, but I would definitely encourage you to download the report. It's online. That number is absolutely in there in the school and college leaver section, and we break down that also by sector.
It's normally lower, isn't it, than graduates? It's normally
fewer. It is lower.
Yeah,
I've
read the report a few times, and unfortunately I can't remember it off the top of my head. But yes, it is normally lower. Interestingly, on actually, I'll come back to this point after. I'll ask the next question first, so I can do 2 in 1 from this morning's session. So the next question was from Leanne, and that was, do you think that continued growth in school leaver and college recruitment is having a longer term impact on graduate recruitment, i.e. displacement, so less graduate recruitment because they're training school leavers?
I think it's a good question. I think so far we have seen continued growth in terms of graduate recruitment. And we've also seen continued growth in terms of school and college leaver recruitment. So it seems that the pie itself is increasing, and it hasn't been shrinking the proportion of graduates that are getting recruited. I think on a broader note, when we look at student loans, the perception of higher education and the pressures of people entering the labor market. Some are wanting to enter earlier, not have a student loan, so they're seeking moving onto an apprenticeship. It poses an interesting question around the value of education in society and how this will impact the school and college leaver market in terms of some of the brightest stars, however you want to put it, going to be seeking apprenticeships right from school and college instead of moving into higher education institutes and taking on the financial burden of a student loan. So I'm not sure 100% if it will lead to a reduction in graduate recruitment. I'll be interested to hear what Stephen has, but I think considering just the broader context of students who are deciding what to do with their future, it is changing the labor market, specifically around people moving more into seeing an apprenticeship as a high skilled thing to do instead of some of the stigma that's been attached to school and college leaver roles previously.
Yes, it's really difficult, isn't it? Because when you've got both figures increasing, it's difficult to know if there has been some displacement. Like you said, it was interesting. We were again on the apprentice forum today talking about just that steady growth regardless of recessions in the economy's need for higher skilled labor force, which probably ties into it as well. I hesitate to talk about growing pies, but when that pool of need gets bigger, it's interesting actually. So James from BPP, who was presenting this morning, was talking through the latest data on apprenticeships, which I hadn't quite picked up yet actually, and that's that there'd been this sort of gradual decline over the last few years in terms of the under 25 starting apprenticeships. That's now reversed. it started to go up.
Interesting.
Yeah, that was really interesting because historically our data has kind of gone counter to some of the stuff that's been happening on broader apprenticeships. And I think that's because our employees tend to be levy payers, larger teams, etc. So that's quite interesting because it does seem that there may be that slight reversal going on. So we'll have to see if that continues. Another question here on the oh, it's all right. I'm just scrolling down my screen of questions. Holly was looking for the report, but she's found it now online. I've got a question for you, Nicola. I'm going to go to get your crystal ball out. What do you think is likely to happen over the next 6 to 12 months? I know we're in a very unpredictable climate at the moment. Do you think we might tip into a reduction in vacancies, or do you think employers will sort of keep their nerve through through the turbulence?
I unfortunately, though, don't quote me on it. Unfortunately,
You're
I
only
wouldn't
live on, on a recorded
put on
webinar.
YouTube. If I had to place a bet, I would think there'll be a reduction in vacancies. I think we all know of some big schemes that have been put on pause. We all know of other little schemes which have been put on pause. Anecdotally, I've had other employers contact me, even since submitting these results, and saying, can they revise the results they put down because they've reduced them. So I think all signs point to people reducing the level of vacancies. But what I entered at the beginning saying, and which I think is very, very important, is if we sort of zoom out 3 years and we look at how tight the labor market will be then in terms of experienced hires and how high their salaries will likely be in some of the digital IT roles, it actually would be more cost effective and better from a sort of talent acquisition point of view to grow the internal pipeline through continued graduate recruitment, instead of then in 3 years thinking, actually now the average salary we need to offer is £60,000 for an experienced hire, when we could have been saving money and growing people internally. So I would be very cautious if it was my business to cancel schemes for short-term cost saving, because I think in the long run, we know that a lot of school and college leavers, interns and placements, move on to graduate schemes move to be experienced hires. So I think in the long run, we know it saves money to move people internally. It's also good for their students to get the opportunity and not have a contracting market. So I think it would be wise not to cut vacancies.
Yeah, I obviously agree the same. We I know that's kind of our bread and butter. Turkey's voting for Christmas, but agree, we've seen it in the past. Employers do cut back their vacancies when the pressure gets high. You can totally understand why. The balance of bringing in new employees when you're trying to protect existing employees, etc., is a tricky one. But we've seen it time again. I've got enough grey hairs to show I've lived through a few recessions, and employers will get it 3 years later. Yeah, and I think even in an even tighter labour market we exist in now, whether it's because of Brexit, whether it's because of people retiring out of the labour force earlier, there's just that. Even if you want to go and buy that talent, it doesn't exist at a more experienced level. So I'd agree that it'll be interesting to see, actually, because I'm a bit like you. I think when it gets tight, particularly on a sector by sector basis, we might see a bit of shrinkage, but I think it will be minimal because of those pressures that we were talking about. So we'll have to see. We will keep a close eye on it with regular pulse surveys and yes, keeping our ears to the ground with what employers are telling us. So it's very difficult. There are no facts about the future, are there? That's it for questions, Nicola.
There's one more, actually.
Oh, there is. Oh yes, so there is. Sorry, I need a bigger box on my screen. So the question is, do you think that some of the difficulties in recruiting could also be linked to COVID and experiences of students over the last few years? For example, are they less prepared for entering labour market than they might have been in previous years due to remote learning, etc.? Reduction in placement opportunities, and I guess even just the normal part-time work that students do. They weren't able to do that during lockdown either. Any thoughts on that?
I think one of the things that we touched on a little bit more in more detail in the development report, which we released earlier in the year, was looking at the sort of socialization of skills into people entering the workforce, and how a lot of that socialization is often done through placements and internships and other opportunities. So I think that there has been a reduction of in confidence. Graduates are graduating typically with less experience in the workforce. However, I think while those things have been linked with COVID because people were working online or a lot of internships and placements were cut, I think that there's still a need to get a job after graduation, and that need on the whole hasn't gone anywhere. But maybe the issue is less about has there been a reduction of people wanting roles, but more about they may have less exposure in the workplace, which means they're finding it harder to get a role. One thing that could also justify some of the lower average application numbers to vacancies is that people are being less scattergun in applying for a lot of different roles. And therefore maybe they're applying for fewer, and that's reduced the number of applications per vacancy slightly as well.
Excellent. And it's interesting, on some of the employer forums that we've been running over the last couple of weeks, it's been a mixed bag, because I've been asking the question actually of all the students that have started this autumn, have they picked up any trends along this line for the new intakes? And it's a mixed bag. Some say there definitely is a difference, a bit less work readiness, a bit less confidence, and range of different factors, where others have said, well, it's it's quite normal for young people transitioning into work. So again, it's something that I think might take a little bit of time to unravel exactly what the differences are. So, oh no, we only have another one. Oh, somebody asking, where can we find the 22 recruitment survey report? Where's the hyperlink? That's in the members area, isn't it, Nicola, on the website?
I believe so. I can try pop it in the chat here.
And you can go back actually over over quite a number of years back. I mean, we've been producing this data for a considerable number of years, so we do have all those previous reports in the archive, although the current report does reference where we can back to year on year figures.
Cool. I just popped an answer in the Q&A answer section with the hyperlink.
Great, thanks, Nicola. So Nicola, this is your last survey presentation for us,
yeah.
which is rather upsetting. Do you want to tell everybody what you're going to do? Because I think it's quite exciting what you're going to be doing, and of course it's relevant to our sector as well.
Yeah, definitely. So I am moving to be full-time as a lecturer in work psychology at the Institute of Work Psychology at the University of Sheffield, in the management school there, but very keen to still be involved in this community and obviously researching a lot of things that are very relevant. So please add me on LinkedIn if you haven't done so, and let's keep in touch, or follow me on Twitter. My details are on LinkedIn and are on our website as well. So yeah, feel free to shoot me an email with any questions forever, and I'm really interested in this as a research area, so don't be a stranger.
Fantastic. Thanks. Yes, we look forward. I'm sure there's plenty of stuff we'll be doing together over the coming months and years. So, and thanks for all your hard work in the time that you've been with us, producing some excellent data as always, and really adding to the kind of information that our sector of the market needs. So that's all from now. As I said at the start, this was recorded. So if you need to get back, if you need to go back and revisit some of the anything that you missed or want to recap on, you'll be getting the link through quite shortly. We'll put it up on our YouTube channel, and of course the survey is online now, and we'll also be going into the data on our various forums over the coming weeks, doing some sector by sector analysis and picking out some of the some of the specific areas, because it is quite a big report. That's one of the challenges. It's a challenge, and we really do appreciate all of you filling it in. We know it takes time. I know when I used to be an employer, it always landed in the inbox, and it was like, right, okay, need to get some time to do that. So we definitely appreciate people taking the time to do it. And we also aware that it takes a little bit of time to digest it. So we will be helping everybody along with that over the coming weeks. So thanks again, Nicola. Thanks for your time. Thanks everybody tuning in. Thanks for those that asked questions. Hopefully we'll be seeing you in person shortly or talk to you all again shortly. We've got EDI conference coming up soon, so you haven't seen that on your radar. We're doing that conference face to face, and we're doing some of our forums face to face now, as we did this morning with the apprentice forum. So if we don't see you virtually, hopefully we'll see you in person soon. Take care, everyone. Bye for now.